He was 19 years old. He had never fired a bazooka in combat, not once. The weapon in his hands was designed for two men, and in the next few hours, on a black volcanic slope on an island most Americans had never heard of, this quiet boy from Long Island was going to do something that no citation could ever fully explain. He would tell you more than 50 years later, sitting on a porch in Florida with the Gulf breeze coming off the water, that the heroes were the ones who did not come home. He would say his medal belonged to two Marines whose weapon he had picked up that morning. He would say very little else. That was his way. His name was Douglas Thomas Jacobson. The island was Iwo Jima. The morning was February 26, 1945. And if you had a father, an uncle, or a grandfather who wore a uniform in the Pacific, this story belongs to them too. The morning began the way every morning had begun on that island, with the smell of sulfur rising from vents in the volcanic rock, with the sound of distant artillery moving across the northern half of the island like a slow approaching storm, with the taste of black ash on every man's tongue. Private First Class Douglas Jacobson pressed his body flat against a shelf of dark stone on the western slope of Hill 382. He had not shaved in 6 days. His uniform was stiff with dried sweat and volcanic dust. His hands were trembling, not entirely from fear, but from the exhaustion that had accumulated over 7 days of continuous combat, from the cold February wind that cut across the island at dawn. He watched the two-man bazooka team crawl forward through the ash. The loader followed behind, dragging a canvas satchel of rockets. They moved the way all Marines moved on Iwo Jima that week. Low, slow, every muscle expecting the next second to be the last one. They made it perhaps 15 yards before the Japanese anti-aircraft gun at the base of the hill opened up with a sound that was not a sound at all. It was a physical thing, a vibration that entered the chest before the ears could register it. 20 millimeters. Designed to shred aircraft in flight, now leveled parallel to the ground, sweeping the slope like a scythe cutting wheat. The gunner went down first. The loader took 2 more steps before the second burst caught him across the middle. Neither one made a sound. The bazooka fell into the ash. The satchel of rockets slid a few feet down the slope. And on the western face of Hill 382, the Marines of Company I, 3rd Battalion, 23rd Marines, went absolutely still, because they all understood the same thing at the same moment. Without that gun destroyed, no one was going up this hill, and without going up this hill, the entire assault on the northern half of the island would stall. And if the assault stalled, thousands more Marines would die on ground they had already paid for in blood. Someone had to get that bazooka. Someone had to do it alone. Douglas Thomas Jacobson had been born on November 25, 1925, in New York, the son of a working-class family with roots on the Long Island shore. As a boy, he worked as a draftsman for his father, learning to draw straight lines with a steady hand, learning the patience of a craftsman who understood that a single crooked stroke could ruin an entire drawing. In the summers, he sat in a wooden tower on the beach and watched swimmers in the Atlantic, ready to run into the surf if one of them went under. He was not a fighter. He was not the kind of boy that other boys were afraid of. He was quiet, he read books, he listened more than he spoke. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, he was 16 years old, and somewhere in the country a radio broke into its regular programming to describe an island most Americans had never heard of, on the far side of the Pacific, where the fleet of the United States Navy had just been attacked. If you are old enough to remember that voice on the radio, you know exactly where you were the moment it came through the speaker. You remember the way your father set down his coffee cup. You remember the way your mother stopped whatever she was doing. That day divided every American life that touched it into a before and an after. Douglas Jacobson never forgot. On January 28, 1943, at the age of 17, he walked into a Marine Corps recruiting office in New York and enlisted. By the time he was 18, he was in the South Pacific. By the time he was 19, he had fought at Roy Namur in February of 1944. He had fought at Saipan in June, where he had carried a Browning automatic rifle through the volcanic hills and the cane fields, and where he had been quietly commended in division orders for his conduct as a BR man. He had fought at Tinian in July, 3 island campaigns, 3 amphibious landings. He had done his job. He had come back to the ranks the way most Marines did, without headlines, without fanfare. He was one of the invisible ones. That was the whole point. He did not know it. lying behind that rock on the morning of February 26th. But before the sun set over the Pacific that evening, his name would be written into a document that would be read aloud in the White House by the President of the United States. 2,000 miles to the north, in a command bunker carved into the volcanic rock beneath Iwo Jima, a 53-year-old Japanese general named Tadamichi Kuribayashi was waiting for the Marines to make their mistake. He had been waiting for 8 months. Kuribayashi was not a typical Japanese commander. He had spent time in the United States in the late 1920s as a young officer, riding across the American Midwest by car, eating in American diners, watching American workers pour steel and roll automobiles off assembly lines by the thousands. He had come home to Japan carrying a secret that he could never say out loud in front of the wrong people. He knew Japan could not win. In private letters, he wrote about the certainty of his own death on this island. Not hoped, not planned, expected. He had accepted his fate the way a farmer accepts the coming of winter. And then, having accepted it, he had turned his entire mind to one question. How do I make my death cost them the most? The answer did not lie on the beaches. Every Japanese commander before him in the Pacific had defended the shoreline. They had lined the sand with troops and machine guns and pillboxes, and every time the Americans had come, the naval bombardment had shredded the defenders before the Marines even landed. Kuribayashi had studied the after-action reports of Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, Peleliu. He had drawn a conclusion no Japanese general had drawn before. The beach was a graveyard not for the Americans, for the defenders. So on Iwo Jima, Kuribayashi did something no one expected. He gave the Americans the beach. He pulled his troops back. He dug them into the volcanic rock. He built a network of tunnels beneath the island, connecting bunkers and blockhouses and hidden gun positions with underground passages that no bomb could reach. He told his men to let the Marines land, to let them think it was easy, to let them walk inland, past the shoreline, into the killing ground he had prepared for 240 days. On February 19, 1945, 30,000 United States Marines walked ashore expecting the worst 3 days of their lives. They walked into 8 months of engineering. They walked into a trap that had been designed and reinforced by a man who had accepted his own death and asked only that it be expensive. For the first day and part of the second, the beach was strangely quiet. Marines pushed inland, thinking they had caught the Japanese off guard. Then, slowly, deliberately, the trap closed. Hidden gun positions on the high ground opened up. Mortars zeroed in from positions no aerial photograph had revealed. Machine guns fired from bunkers so well camouflaged that Marines walked past them and were shot from behind. 3 days after the landing, on February 23rd, on a small mountain at the southern tip of the island called Kuribayashi, 5 Marines and a Navy corpsman raised the American flag. A photographer named Joe Rosenthal captured the moment in a single frame that would become the most famous photograph of the Second World War. That flag was still flying. 3 days later, on the morning Douglas Jacobson lay in the ash on the western slope of Hill 382. If you were old enough in 1945, you saw that photograph in every newspaper in the country, on posters at the post office, on the covers of magazines. The men in that photograph were called heroes. 3 of them would be dead within days of it being taken. Douglas Jacobson never saw those newspapers. He was busy with the reason they existed. Marines called Hill 382 the meat grinder. The name was not a metaphor. It was the literal word that came out of their mouths when they tried to describe what was happening to their friends. In 7 days of fighting, the 23rd Marines had lost nearly half their strength. Company after company had assaulted this hill. Every assault ended the same way. The Japanese would wait. They would let the Marines cross the open ground. They would let them come within 30, 40, 50 yards of the summit. And then, from positions the naval bombardment had failed to touch, they would open fire from every angle at once. Machine guns from the flanks, rifles from the front, mortars from the reverse slope, anti-tank guns hidden in crevices, Sherman tanks burned in the ash. Flamethrower teams were cut down before they got within range of their targets. Entire squads walked into 100 yards of open ground and simply ceased to exist. Hill 382 rose 125 feet above the beaches. It was not large. A man could walk from the base to the summit in 5 minutes on flat ground. But this ground was not flat, and this hill was not walkable, and the Japanese had spent 8 months turning every square meter of it into a place where American boys came to die. The hill was called 382 for a reason. That was its height in feet, a number on a map, a number that had cost more Marine lives per foot than almost any other piece of ground in the Pacific. On the morning of February 26th, Company I began its assault at 0900 hours. In the first 30 minutes, the company took heavy casualties. The assault broke down. The men went to ground behind whatever cover they could find. Rocks, shell craters. The bodies of the men who had died in front of them. The Japanese fire did not stop. It did not pause. It came from positions the Marines could not even see. Muzzle flashes flickering from slits in the earth. Machine gun bursts from bunkers so well camouflaged that a man could stare directly at one and never see it until it killed him. And then, into that stillness, the two-man bazooka team had made their attempt. And then they had died. And then the bazooka had fallen. Jacobson lay behind the shelf of volcanic rock and looked at the weapon. It was out there in the open. Between him and it lay ground swept by a gun that could tear a man apart in less than a second. And beyond it lay the hill, and beyond the hill lay the rest of the 23rd Marines, waiting for someone to break the line. Jacobson knew what a bazooka was. Every Marine knew. A shoulder-fired tube that hurled a rocket capable of turning a bunker into a smoking hole in the ground. He also knew what a bazooka required. 2 men, one to aim and fire, one to load the rocket into the rear of the tube, connect the electrical ignition wire, tap the gunner to signal it was ready, and step clear of the backblast that erupted from the open end when the weapon fired. You did not fire a bazooka alone. Nobody fired a bazooka alone. The entire concept was outside of doctrine. Jacobson looked at the weapon in the ash. He looked at the anti-aircraft gun at the base of the hill. He looked at Company I, pinned down around him, unable to move, dying by inches, while officers on the radio begged for artillery that could not reach targets buried in volcanic rock. He thought about his father. He thought about the drafting table. He thought about the straight lines he used to draw as a boy, the patience it took to hold the pencil steady, the way a single crooked stroke could ruin the entire drawing. He was not a hero. He knew that. He was just the closest man to the bazooka. Douglas Jacobson set his rifle down in the ash. He took a breath that he was not sure he would ever release. And then, alone, without orders, without a plan, without anyone to help him, he rose from cover and ran toward the weapon that was never meant to be carried by one man. He would not know it for another 5 decades, but the decision he had just made would change not only his life, but the shape of the entire battle for Iwo Jima. The anti-aircraft gun saw him. Jacobson knew it in the same instant the gunner did, because the black barrel 100 yards downhill twitched, corrected, and began to swing toward the moving target that had just broken cover on the slope above. He ran. 15 yards is not a long distance. A man in good shoes on a football field can cover it in 2 seconds. But this was not a football field. This was ankle-deep volcanic ash that swallowed every step, sharp coral that tore through the leather of his boots, and a slope that pitched forward under his weight and tried to send him down face first into the killing ground. The first burst came before he was halfway there. Rounds passed so close to his shoulder that he felt the air split. The sound arrived a heartbeat later, and by then, he was already diving, already sliding, already crashing into the ash beside the bodies of the 2 Marines who had died carrying the weapon he now needed. He did not look at their faces. He could not afford to. He grabbed the launcher tube with his right hand. He grabbed the canvas satchel with his left. The weight was more than he expected. He rolled sideways behind a cluster of shattered rock some distance from the Japanese gun. The gunner fired again. Rounds tore chunks out of the rock above his head. Volcanic dust rained down into his collar. He lay flat, breathing hard, and for the first time since he had left cover, he allowed himself to look at what he was holding. He set the launcher on the ground. He pulled a rocket from the satchel. He slid it into the rear of the tube. He connected the ignition wire the way he had watched other men do it. His hands moved slowly. Too slowly. The Japanese gunner would not wait forever. He lifted the tube onto his shoulder. The weight pulled him off balance. His left hand shot up to steady the barrel. His right found the wooden grip and the trigger. The rear of the tube was open. And behind that opening, if he fired now, the backblast would erupt in a cone of fire. He turned his head. There was nobody behind him. He was alone. He rose from cover, sighted, and pulled the trigger. Fire and smoke erupted from both ends of the launcher. The recoil punched into his shoulder like a horse's kick. The rocket crossed the distance in less than a second and struck the anti-aircraft gun's steel shield. The shaped charge detonated. The gun and its crew disappeared in a flash of orange flame. Company I was already moving. Somewhere behind him, an officer was shouting. Somewhere behind him, Marines were rising from cover for the first time in an hour. But Jacobson was not watching them. He was already flat on his belly again, pulling another rocket from the satchel, loading it into the tube, wrapping the ignition wire around the contact. He did not stop. What happened over the next stretch of that morning has been recorded in the careful, restrained language of an official Medal of Honor citation, as one continuous action across the whole of that hill. The record lists the positions. The record does not and cannot capture what it felt like to move from one to the next alone on a slope that was still killing Marines with every passing minute. 2 Japanese machine gun emplacements higher on the slope opened fire on the advancing Marines. Positions dug into the earth and covered with logs and volcanic rock. Positions the naval bombardment had failed to touch. Positions that only the muzzle flashes gave away. Jacobson attacked them. He crawled through ash and shattered coral. The rocks tore his uniform at the knees and elbows. He kept his head down and the launcher tucked against his side. He worked his way around the flank of the first position, and when he was close enough to see the barrel of the Japanese heavy machine gun traversing left and right, he fired. The rocket struck the earthen cover of the emplacement and detonated. The machine gun stopped firing forever. The second position swung its barrel toward him. He was already moving. He rolled left as bullets tore through the space where he had just been. He dove behind a shallow depression and lay panting with his face pressed into the ash. His ears were ringing. His shoulder throbbed from the launcher's recoil. The second gun crew was hunting him now. They were firing short bursts at every rock and shadow, trying to drive him into the open. They fired to his left. They fired to his right. They walked their fire back and forth across the slope, patient, methodical. He waited. He listened. When the pause came, he rose. He shouldered the tube. The gun crew saw him at the same moment he saw them. The barrel began to swing, but Jacobson had already fired. The rocket struck the gun mount and detonated in a burst of dirt and metal. 3 positions, and the morning had only just begun. Ahead of him, blocking the route to the summit, stood a reinforced blockhouse. Walls of concrete thick enough to have survived direct hits from American naval gunfire during the pre-invasion bombardment. A single firing slit at the front, wide enough to cover the entire southwestern approach with interlocking fire. 14-inch shells from the older American battleships had hit this blockhouse. 8-inch rounds from heavy cruisers. The concrete showed scorch marks. It showed chipped corners, but the walls still stood, and inside, Japanese defenders were waiting. Jacobson studied the structure the way he had once studied his father's drafting drawings. He looked at the angles, he looked at the lines of sight, he looked at the assumptions the Japanese engineers had made when they chose where to place their walls. The firing slit faced southwest. The main Marine approach was southwest. Everything about this blockhouse was designed to stop an enemy coming up that slope in that direction. Nothing on the north side. The north side faced away from the beaches. The north side faced into the Japanese defensive perimeter, into terrain no American was ever supposed to reach. Jacobson began to move north. He crawled through ash and rock. His uniform was black with dust. The launcher tube scraped against every stone. Somewhere behind him, Company I was still pinned down, taking fire from positions higher on the hill. But nobody in the blockhouse was watching the back wall. Why would they? He reached the rear of the structure. He attacked it there with the bazooka and with demolition charges. In a fight the citation would describe in a single sentence, and that must have felt, to the 19-year-old private first class living through it, like an eternity. When the smoke cleared, the blockhouse was silent. 4 positions. He had no rockets. The bazooka was useless without ammunition, and the ammunition was somewhere behind him, past the bodies of the 2 Marines whose weapon he had picked up. Getting back there meant crossing open ground under Japanese observation. He picked up the empty launcher and started walking. The route took him through terrain the Japanese snipers had zeroed hours ago. He heard a round crack past his head. He heard another strike the ash to his left. He did not run. Running attracted the eye. He walked slowly, deliberately, using every depression and every rock cluster, keeping his silhouette broken up against the black slope. He reached the ammunition point. He resupplied, and as he turned to head back up the slope, a mortar round struck nearby. Shrapnel screamed overhead. He threw himself flat. A second round hit closer, then a third. The Japanese observers on the summit had spotted movement and were bracketing the ammunition dump. He ran. Weight on his back, uphill, through volcanic ash, while mortars walked across the slope behind him. His lungs were on fire. His mouth was so dry that his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth. He did not stop, because somewhere on that hill, and somewhere on the eastern slope he could not yet see, Marines were still dying while he was still moving. Back on the western slope he found the next target, a Japanese pillbox, smaller than the blockhouse. Concrete buried into the volcanic rock, with a narrow firing slit designed to minimize exposure while allowing a wide field of fire. A 5-man crew inside, a machine gun cutting down anyone who approached from the eastern flank. The Japanese in the pillbox had seen the blockhouse die. They knew what was coming. Jacobson attacked the pillbox with demolition charges, closed to within striking distance under fire, and destroyed it. 5 positions. The next target was cruder, a rifle pit, overhead cover made of logs and just a hole in the ground where Japanese riflemen had been picking off Marines below them for the past 2 hours. Artillery could not touch a target like this. The earth absorbed the blast. Direct fire could not reach it because the angle was wrong. But Jacobson was above it now. He had climbed higher than the defenders had expected anyone to climb. He aimed downward. He fired. The rocket punched through the log cover and detonated inside the pit. 6 positions. And ahead, on the slope leading to the summit, waited the position Kuribayashi's engineers had considered impossible to overcome. 6 interconnected Japanese fighting positions, a defensive arc across the slope, every emplacement supporting every other one, every field of fire overlapping every neighbor. The 23rd Marines had tried to break this cluster twice already, and both attempts had failed with catastrophic losses. Jacobson attacked it alone. The record would say that he destroyed the entire cluster and killed 10 more Japanese defenders in the process. The record would not say what it felt like to move from one position to the next, low on ammunition, running on nothing but adrenaline and the memory of straight lines drawn on a drafting table on Long Island. But when the smoke cleared, the cluster no longer existed as a fighting position. That would have been enough for one morning. It was more than any citation before or since had asked of a 19-year-old private first class. Jacobson was not finished. Somewhere on the eastern slope of Hill 382, another Marine company from a neighboring unit had become pinned down. He could hear their machine gun fire. He could see their tracers arcing uselessly into the volcanic rock, and above them, invisible from where they were pinned, sat another Japanese pillbox, pouring machine gun fire into the ravine where they had taken cover. They were dying, and they did not know Jacobson existed. He went to help them. He crossed the ground under fire. He found the pillbox. He silenced it. And as he was doing so, a Japanese Type 95 light tank appeared out of a draw on the eastern face of the hill, moving up to intercept the Marine advance. 7 tons, 37mm main gun, 2 machine guns, a crew of 3 buttoned up inside armor that would have been a joke against a Sherman, but was more than enough against dismounted Marines with nothing but rifles. The turret swung. The main gun elevated. Jacobson attacked the tank with the bazooka. His rocket struck the turret. The turret mechanism jammed. Smoke poured from the commander's hatch. The tank could no longer traverse its gun. The tank could no longer fight. Marines below him rose out of the ash and began to move. 15 positions. Jacobson looked up the slope. The summit of Hill 382 rose in front of him, and there on the highest ground sat the last position. The largest blockhouse on the hill, a structure that had absorbed direct fire from American battleships during the pre-invasion bombardment and was still standing. Reinforced concrete, multiple firing slits, Japanese defenders inside, waiting. Jacobson attacked it. He closed with it under fire. He fired his last rocket into its rear structure. He entered it with grenades and rifle and pistol, alone, in a fight the citation would describe in a single line, and that must have felt, in the moment, like walking into the mouth of hell itself. When it was over, the blockhouse was silent. 16 positions. That was what the official record would eventually say. 16 enemy positions destroyed, approximately 75 Japanese defenders dead. The anchor of the entire northern defensive line on Iwo Jima, the position Kuribayashi's engineers had spent 8 months preparing, was in American hands. The Marines of Company I reached the summit at noon. By 1 o'clock, the 23rd Marines held the high ground. By afternoon, they had begun clearing the reverse slope. Company I had lost 43 men killed or wounded that day. Jacobson walked down the slope at 1400 hours. His uniform was torn. His face was black with volcanic dust and powder residue. His hands were bleeding from the coral. He carried the empty bazooka tube in one hand and his rifle in the other, and when he passed the bodies of the 2 Marines whose weapon he had picked up that morning, he stopped for a moment. He did not say anything. There was nothing to say. A Navy corpsman checked him at the base of the hill. Minor cuts, bruises across his shoulder and his back, severe dehydration. No serious injuries. Someone asked him how he had done it. He said he did not know. He said he had one thing in mind: getting off that hill. The battle for Iwo Jima went on for another month. The island was not declared secured until the 16th of March. Real combat continued until the 26th. 6,821 Marines died on that 8-square-mile piece of volcanic rock. Nearly 20,000 were wounded. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders, only 216 surrendered. Tadamichi Kuribayashi, the general who had waited 8 months for the Marines to make their mistake, is believed to have died in late March of 1945, though the exact date remains unknown, and his body was never found. He had gotten what he wanted. He had made his death expensive. 27 Medals of Honor were awarded for actions on Iwo Jima, more than any other battle in American history. When Admiral Chester Nimitz spoke about the Marines who fought on that island, he used a phrase that has been carved into stone at more than one memorial. He said that among the Americans who served there, uncommon valor was a common virtue. Douglas Jacobson was one of them. He was promoted to corporal in April of 1945. He returned to the United States in September, and on the 5th of October 1945, he stood in a room in the White House, a 19-year-old boy in a dress uniform he barely knew how to wear, and President Harry S. Truman placed the pale blue ribbon of the Medal of Honor around his neck. Standing beside him that same day was another Marine. His name was Jacqueline Lucas. He was 17 years old. On the 3rd day of the Iwo Jima landings, he had thrown himself on top of 2 Japanese grenades to save the men in his fighting whole. He had survived. He would carry the shrapnel in his body for the rest of his life. 2 boys, same battle, same island, same morning of terror on the same volcanic ash, same president, same ribbon, same day. The youngest Medal of Honor recipients of the Second World War standing side by side in the East Room of the White House, still teenagers. There is a photograph of that day. If you find it, you will see 2 boys who look like they cannot believe where they are. Jacobson was discharged in December of 1945. He went home to New York. He tried to sleep. He tried to be 19 years old again. Some men who came home from that war never stopped hearing the artillery. Some men flinched at doors slamming for the rest of their lives. Some men woke up sweating in the middle of the night for 50 years without ever telling their wives why. Douglas Jacobson did not talk much about what he had seen. Most of them did not. That generation was not raised to talk. They were raised to endure. In April of 1946, 4 months after leaving the Marine Corps, he walked back into a recruiting office and re-enlisted. Some men could not stay away. He was one of them. He attended officer candidate school at Quantico. He was commissioned a 2nd lieutenant in March of 1954. He served in Japan, in Okinawa, in China, in Vietnam. He rose through the ranks the way men did in the peacetime corps, quietly, without headlines, one promotion at a time. Near the end of his career, his commanding officer discovered something no one had ever noticed before. Jacobson did not have a high school diploma. He had left school before graduating in order to enlist in 1943, and in more than 20 years of service, in all those promotions, in all those signatures on all those forms, no one had ever asked whether he had finished the 10th grade. He was 42 years old. He took the GED exam. He passed. The man who had destroyed 16 enemy positions in a single morning at the age of 19 sat in a classroom at the age of 42 and answered questions about algebra and American history so that he could stay in the Marine Corps. He received his diploma in 1967. He retired as a major after 24 years of service. He moved to New Jersey. He worked as a real estate agent. He married a school teacher he had met while stationed in Okinawa. In 1987, they moved to Florida. He mowed his lawn. He talked to his neighbors about the weather. He did not talk about the war unless someone asked, and even then, he did not say much. He never called himself a hero. He would tell you, if you pressed him, that the heroes were the ones who did not come home. The two Marines whose weapon he had picked up. The boys who had died in the ash at the base of Hill 382 while he was still lying behind a rock deciding whether to move. If you visited him in Florida in the years before he died, you would have seen an ordinary older man on an ordinary porch, in an ordinary neighborhood, in an ordinary Florida town. You would not have known what was under his shirt. You would not have guessed what was in his past. That was how his whole generation lived after the war. Ordinary men who had done extraordinary things, and who never wanted to be reminded of either one. Douglas Thomas Jacobson died on the 20th of August, 2000 in Port Charlotte, Florida. Congestive heart failure and pneumonia. He was 74 years old. He is buried at Arlington National Cemetery. If you have ever visited Arlington, you have walked past thousands of white stones like his. Each one a name, each one a story, each one a boy who came home in a box, or an old man who came home whole and lived the rest of his life in the quiet way most of them did. The state of Florida named a veterans nursing home after him. The Douglas T. Jacobson State Veterans Nursing Home still stands in Port Charlotte, caring for the old men who came home from wars that Jacobson understood in a way no one else ever could. He was a 19-year-old draftsman from Long Island who lay behind a rock on the morning of the 25th of February 1945, looked at a weapon meant for two men, and made a decision that no training manual had ever prepared him to make. 16 positions, 1 Marine, 1 bazooka, 1 hill on an island that most Americans have never heard of, in a war that fewer and fewer people remember every year. He is gone now. They are almost all gone. The men who landed at Normandy, the men who flew the bombers over Germany, the men who froze at the Chosin Reservoir, the men who came ashore at Iwo Jima on February 19th and did not come off it for a month, if they came off it at all. There are fewer of them alive today than at any point since the war ended, and every year the number falls further, and one day soon there will be none. If you are watching this, there is a chance your father wore a uniform in that war, or your uncle, or your grandfather. Maybe he came home and never spoke of it. Maybe he came home changed. Maybe he did not come home at all, and his name is carved on a stone somewhere in this country, one name among hundreds of thousands. Say his name today, out loud, in whatever room you are sitting in right now. Douglas Jacobson would want that. He would say the medal on his chest belonged to those men, not to him. He would say every name carved on every stone in every cemetery from Arlington to the Punch Bowl belongs to a boy who was ordinary until the day he was not. Say his name, then say the name of the one you loved. That is how we keep them alive. And for as long as you remember, Douglas Jacobson is still walking down the slope of Hill 382, empty bazooka tube in his hand on his way home.